Welcome back. I understand there was maybe not as much flip chart writing, but even better because there was so much conversation and so much engagement, and assuredly that was the goal in the first place. So thanks for promptly returning, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Dan Zimmerly, who will moderate a panel on methane regulatory landscape, improving inventories and accelerating reductions. And for those of you who don't know Dan, you're missing out. Dan is one of the best storytellers.
Remember, I can get you back.
Hey, I'm being kind here. Yeah, I know. You make it hard to tell jokes. I mean, this is a problem. You and Dave both, leave yourselves no room to heckle. So it's harder. But, Dan is such a great storyteller and such a great synthesizer of scientific data and information and the scientific journey into business relevance, policy relevance, and into the classroom. And so I'm so honored to be with you up here, Dan, and I'll hand it to you. We will put up the QR code as the questions get rolling in a little bit. So over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So our first speaker, Carrie, will not be here today. Because her son had an accident. He needs some work on his ankle or something. So she won't be able to attend. And I'd like to say I really miss not having Carrie here because a few of you might have noticed that the EPA has been very prolific recently. They've written thousands of pages of stuff. And so whenever I have a question about the regulation, I sort of use my lifeline to Carrie and her team at Harvard to ask questions, really dumb questions like, which page should we look for about this thing? Okay, and then we get a response back from Carrie or Hannah in 24 hours or something like that. It's been an absolute lifesaver. So the way we're going to run the panel is we'll go through our three speakers, and they'll each do a few minutes. So we'll start with David Lyon from EPA. Then we'll go to Steph Rucker from Colorado's Air Pollution Control Division. We just call them CDPHE, and I realize people don't always know what that means. And then we'll go to James Diamond from ECCC. So David, go ahead.
Thanks, Dan. Great. So welcome. First, an apologies to those of you who know me from my former job at EDF. I'm used to more multimedia presentations, but now at EPA, I'll be giving the standard text-heavy EPA slide deck, but I'll try to get through it quickly. So I started in EPA in February of this year as a special advisor to help implement the Inflation Reduction Act, so particularly the methane provisions, such as the Methane Emissions Reduction Program. So the IRA, this section, had two main parts. So one was having a financial and technical assistance for oil and gas. So there's $1.5 billion that will be distributed to do activities to monitor and mitigate methane. The first, we're partnering with Department of Energy, National Energy Technology Laboratory to distribute that funding. And the first solicitation was $350 million for marginal well plugging. That went to states, and those applications were due yesterday, so excited to see that money to go out to help reduce methane emissions. Other part is a waste emissions charge, so companies will be charged on their methane emissions over a certain threshold, paying a fee, and it's going to be based on Subpart W, their greenhouse gas reporting program estimates. But it also had required EPA to update greenhouse gas reporting program to use empirical data to increase the accuracy of reported emissions. And that has to be done by August 2024. So EPA in the summer proposed some revisions to Subpart W, so I'll be talking about that today. And the comments were due, I believe it was just this last week. So we received over 200 comments and are currently analyzing comments, including a bunch of great comments from people in this room. So overview of the proposed revisions. So first is that we are having more use of empirical data to increase the accuracy, so including some more additional direct measurement calculation methodologies and some revisions including some changes to emission factors and requiring more actual parameter data to be measured rather than just assumed. And then also incorporation of using remote sensing data for large emission releases. We're also adding several sources. You can see here some things including like combustion slip, and then also improving the actual data, the granularity of the data. So for onshore production and gathering, have emissions reported at the well pad gathering site level rather than just total basin emissions. So first off, kind of our approach of improving the accuracy is one is using this more empirical data, and we're defining empirical data pretty broadly, so it doesn't just mean actual emissions data, but can mean things like operational data that's used to inform engineering equations. So we looked at a lot of ways where we could use direct measurements to increase the accuracy, but there were still some places where couldn't quite figure out how to use direct measurements at this time. But there may be future updates that have some more of these revisions. So looking at first one, the big one that had changes is equipment leaks. So formerly this had to use like a leaker or equipment factors. So this will change so that you can now use OGI to figure out the number of leaks and use emission factors, or you can directly measure all the leaks. And coming up with a way of actually, I think, measuring some leaks in some cases to get site-specific emission factors. Also, having some adjustment factors based on OGI because some data showing you miss leaks, so making sure that we're accounting for the kind of the emissions that don't get measured. And then we're trying to link the greenhouse gas reporting program with the new source performance standard, the actual methane regulation, which has similar provisions, including things on a super emitter response program, so trying to have more linkages between subpart W and the rule. So for the large release events, this applies to all segments, and these are kind of unplanned events that cause emissions that are not accounted for by the other methods. So we have two thresholds to see if these are accounted. So first, having a total emission rate of 250 metric tons of CO2 equivalents, but also just a single emission rate of 100 kilograms per hour. So one of the issues is what is the duration of these events. So you can use data, including some kind of parameter data, to figure out what's the duration. But if you don't have any data, you have to use basically half a year assumption. So hoping that will incentivize companies to actually measure and try to figure out the real duration of these events, since they may last hours rather than 180 days. And including data such as the location of those emission sources and reporting requirements, including like who found it. So just a quick chart showing all the various changes and what kind of measurements, what kind of emission estimation approaches are being used for all the different sources. And then just have some links here if you want to see the 200-page rule, or you can go to the docket and see all the comments. But yeah, thank you for your time.
We'll move on to Steph now. And remember, we're collecting questions.
Okay.
And so I have a few questions to keep things moving afterward, but I'm really relying on all of you out there to populate the question list. So going on to Steph.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Rucker. With the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, that's what CDPHE stands for, the Air Pollution Control Division. And as many of you maybe know, Colorado has been working on oil and gas issues for a number of years now, really since at least 2006-ish, 2005, and been progressively building on our regulations during that entire time. And so, our goal, at least at the beginning, was really around VOC and NOx, and that was because we had an ozone non-attainment area, and we continue to have an ozone non-attainment area. But in 2014, we took some initiative to actually start regulating hydrocarbons instead of just VOC, or volatile organic compounds. And by doing that, we brought methane under the umbrella, and that was something that we were really excited about, because now we have a mechanism to look at some reductions of methane, not just VOC. But it was a nice little side benefit to our primary function, our primary goal, which was reducing VOC emissions from the oil and gas segment. In 2018, what we realized in trying to implement that 2014 rule is that operators didn't actually know what to do. And so we really worked hard with operators to come up with a more fundamental concept, and which is design and then operate and maintain. Going all the way back to, you can't just stick a control device at the end and expect that to work. You actually have to redesign your whole system. You have to start at the beginning and then think about, how is it designed in the first place? How do we need to operate it such that it does what it's supposed to do? And then how do we keep maintenance? How do we maintain this equipment? And so that's really what came out of the 2014 rulemaking, was kind of over those several years getting to that point. And then in 2019, we decided we needed more reporting than what we had historically been getting, which was an every 5-year update, and there were no greenhouse gas reporting requirements. And so in 2019, we established a new rule that they have to report on an annual basis, and they have to report all greenhouse gas emissions as well as NOx, VOC, and CO. And the exciting thing about that was that we stopped caring about some of the quote-unquote de minimis sources. Historically, we considered certain types of equipment or certain emission sources as too small to care about. You might be surprised, but once upon a time, we didn't care about storage tanks at all. We certainly, for many years, I remember being a part of the rulemaking where we actually removed the crude oil exemption, where crude oil tanks with an API gravity of less than 40 didn't have to be reported. And so these have been kind of evolving over the number of years, but we took it a step further with that annual inventory requirement that said, we don't care where it's coming from. We don't care whether it's pre-production or production. We were stepping away from the more typical structure around stationary sources and the ongoing actual emissions, from that stationary source, and thinking more broadly about what are all of the emissions coming from the upstream and midstream segments of the oil and gas sector. And so in 2020, our legislature gave us the authority to regulate greenhouse gases directly. That was something that had not been in our statute prior to that. And so we were terribly excited that we were actually getting authority from our legislature to regulate greenhouse gases. And Robin Willie and I were the two that we were in the midst of creating a new office of innovations. And when this kind of came about, they said, who should work on the oil and gas sector for greenhouse gas emissions? And Robin and I have been working on it pretty consistently since 2014. And we were like, I have ideas. I have lots of ideas. So all of the things that we maybe hadn't been able to do because we didn't have the authority to do, or things that we had learned kind of through implementation, we knew we had ideas for new things that we could get actually on the books. And we could change the focus, because when you're talking about VOC, and especially when it has to go through an EPA SIP process, state implementation plan process, it can get very rigid in terms of how you develop the program. But for greenhouse gases, this was state only. So we got to have a little more creativity and a little more flexibility. And so we put together a number of rules that included command and control rules, which is essentially that point, you have to go and figure out what your emissions are and control those emissions by 95%. Or you have to have an emission standard for a particular piece of equipment. So it did include some of those. But probably the two biggest pieces, the flexible pieces that came out of that, were the upstream intensity program and then the midstream steering committee, which was to look at combustion equipment at midstream operations and how they reduce emissions from combustion equipment. So what we did in 2021 was establish the intensity program, and then what we needed to do in 2023 was come up with this verification program. Because back in 2021, we were having flights done, and we were getting methane readings around the state, and we were getting our first methane inventory for 2020, and we were looking at all of this and thinking, okay, we can use this and we can create it. And Dan was out at CSU working on the MEAT model, and we were like, yes, we're going to use the MEAT model, and that's exactly what we're going to do, and we're going to put it in reg, and we're going to move forward. And Dan was like, stop. No, we are not ready to put that into reg. And so what we realized was that this all needed more time to evolve. And so we came back with a verification rule in 2020, just in July here, and passed that rule with consensus from operators as well as EDF and Earth Justice and Clean Air Task Force and others. And so that was a huge accomplishment to come up with this verification rule. And now we have to do the hard work of actually implementing it and saying, okay, this is how you comply with this rule. And it has to be flexible because this technology is evolving so fast. But what it did was say, you can't just take your intensity calculation and use your emissions from what you typically report. You have to have an element of measurement that informs that inventory. And that's the really key piece, is that we finally put a regulatory requirement and we linked it to an accurate inventory using measurement. And by doing that, we've kind of changed the game. And so now we are moving into that space of how do we do that? And how do we do that knowing that what we know right now and what we're going to do for a 2025 implementation is going to be different than what we do for 2027 and 2030. So that's really kind of where we are right now. We're continuing to work on the midstream rule as well, for those of you that are interested in midstream. And that combustion rule will come out in 2024, where we're going to really be looking at engines. And especially now that we know that methane slip is actually a lot higher than what we were anticipating in 2021, that's going to be a really interesting rule to follow. So that's where we are.
So good, thank you, Steph. And we'll move over to James to talk about Environment and Climate Change Canada.
Thanks, Dan. And maybe the first thing is to explain what Environment and Climate Change Canada is. So that is our federal government department, Department of Environment, but now entitled Environment and Climate Change Canada. So analogous to the EPA in many ways, but I think one of the things that will come out as we talk through this panel in particular is that we're all operating under the rules that are given to us, and whether or not we've got a reference to constitutional authority or definitions within our enabling regulations or acts enabling those regulations. Even when we want to do the same thing, we can't quite do it the same way. So the policies might be very well aligned in a broad sense, but when we try to execute them within the processes that we have to work under, you might see things that are pretty different. So I only brought one slide, and it was really just to say that we've been busy more than anything else. A decade in development for policy, but seriously, like every year something new has come out in a federal government context in Canada. The early days were much like Colorado, looking either at air toxics rules or, I mean, we've had authorities for climate policy, but not specific to methane at that time. It was large final emitters and trying to understand how we're going to bring together rules that are relevant to an oil and gas industry. And I would say in particular at that time, we just didn't have a good enough view into the inventory to even understand how to design rules or to see change if we were going to design rules. So we were working independently of the inventory that happens within our science group, within Environment and Climate Change Canada, but they had a trajectory for an inventory based largely on production and a couple of data points, and we said, well, we don't even know what sources to manage within that from a policy context, so let's build another model and let's design some regulations on that. Let's see what's going on with some of the measurements that were happening here at the university, and EDF was publishing at that time and saying, okay, so what can we grasp and how do we start a policy journey that way? The other aspect of it that I think is important is that my job to explain to my bosses in the bureaucracy and ultimately the politicians is to say, so we don't have the right numbers, but we got numbers that are good enough for us to do something from a regulatory perspective. So that was probably the biggest hurdle for us. The pressure that was coming at us was, well, wait, get better numbers. You're not able to justify the actions that you want to take. Largely following what was happening in the U.S. at that time, this idea of a first step, that 40 to 45% reduction in the sector. I mean, I think we had more than enough information to say here are a few key sources that if you manage well enough, if you introduce changes from a regulatory perspective, you'll see that kind of change. But year by year, as we're either publishing something from a federal perspective, looking at provincial regulations, evaluating our own policies, putting out a discussion paper on where we go next. Every year, there's new information informing that inventory, and that causes us to rethink the numbers that we're trying to use to justify our actions. And ultimately, the test for us from a federal perspective is this an efficient policy is it an efficient climate policy that Canada's public is going to buy into? So once you get into the climate rules and the idea of a social cost of carbon or of methane, we've got a lot of room to play. And as we see the numbers move higher, we can justify that action in a way that we would not have been able to a decade ago. So I then was saying we're definitely at the next stage right now, not in that kind of first step, but ultimate step or next ultimate step. And can we put the right levers in motion so that we see that happen in a federal context? And I think we'll talk through some questions about what that means constitutionally and who does what. But I'd leave you with, I think, some relation to what was mentioned already this morning as companies are making some changes. The regulations, for me, have a place to try to drive home some of the culture change that is needed for this change. My background's chemical in its genesis for me, chemical engineering, and then working in the chemical industry, and the responsible care program is something that I'm always reminded of as we look at this kind of change. In the chemical industry, I kind of was faced with this similar kind of challenge that they're viewed as an industry that's not doing what it needs to be doing. And regulations are a part of that, but it's really about changing the culture collectively to see that methane, this invisible, odorless gas that doesn't appear to be a problem, is a problem that we're all going to be managing. So, thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to kick off the questions with an external observer's view, where there just seems to be a lot happening. So my first question to each of the jurisdictions on the stage is how are the different agencies, the different sub-jurisdictions in your area coordinating their programs? 3 years ago, I told my team that we needed to find something to do besides methane because it wasn't going to last forever. Okay, so here we are with 1,500 pages of methane rules from the federal government and stuff. How is that being coordinated in your jurisdiction?
So I guess I'll start. Coordination. Who needs coordination? I think we've always benefited from EPA taking a look at what we've done in Colorado and then working through NSPS Quado and its various iterations that have come out over the number of years to figure out how that aligns with rules that we already have on the books. And so there's a lot of effort to at least think about how operators need to comply with all of the various rules so that we're not super duplicative. Obviously, there's always going to be some amount of that because definitions aren't quite the same, but they're very close. Or, the way that it's implemented is maybe just slightly different. So it's a hard thing to do on the state level. Sometimes we're able to show equivalence, which I think is always preferred because then we can say just follow our rules. You don't have to follow a different record-keeping structure or a different, type of rule that's very slightly different than what we have on our Colorado requirements. And so that's always really helpful as well. And so that's another way. We also have conversations with EPA pretty regularly where we're sharing, these are the things that we're working on, things that we're thinking. And sometimes we get information back from EPA, but not super often. We're not any more in the know than anyone else. So, but we definitely want to help provide guidance to EPA as best we can on the stuff that we know, and then we are also looking to them for guidance on other things where we've done a lot on pneumatics over the last many years, and then we've held off for a few years because we're kind of waiting for EPA to finalize what they want to do so we don't put something in place that seems, to clash with what EPA does. So there are a number of different kind of drivers that we're always looking at.
Great. Well, thanks, Steph. You described, I think, EPA's collaboration pretty well. But yeah, we are limited in the rulemaking process to kind of follow the former procedures. So we do have meetings with states, particularly Colorado, where they inform us about what they're doing. But as she said, we can't really give much information back except what's kind of on the public record. But we are always looking for input for people to give information that we can consider. And then I think after the rules are finalized, there will be a lot more collaboration with like the regional offices and the states for coming up with the implementation of the rules. But it's a little frustrating sometimes, but we're trying to make sure it's a fair process. But yes, if you don't mind kind of one-sided conversations, it's always great. We love hearing information from the states and other stakeholders.
And parallel process in Canada, for sure. There are definitely things that align in terms of the processes that we work through to develop regulations, and times when the process dictates how open we can be. I would say when I talk about the time that has evolved over the last many years, there's a good working relationship between the key jurisdictions in Canada that are working on oil and gas regulations and us as a federal government. It was a new space that we moved into 10 years ago. The historical regulation of the energy industry sits with the provinces. It is a shared constitutional jurisdiction from an environmental perspective, but the resource development is all provincial. So we are seen to be interlopers even when we move into a space that we're constitutionally able to. So that's an important relationship to manage. And the Canadian Environmental Protection Act actually sets out rules around equivalency so that if we don't want to be seen duplicating regulatory measures, that we can stand down from a federal perspective. That in itself is a complex regulatory process to do, though. So some of the circles that you saw in my outline was us putting regulations in place, watching the province kind of replicate that in a form that made sense to them, and then us removing our federal regulations 2 years later so that jurisdiction is wholly managed by the provinces. So complicated ongoing efforts for sure, and I would say with EPA and the states, watching individual action in Colorado and California, other jurisdictions here, like always making that comparison. It's certainly a test for us that's always there from a consultation perspective. Do we understand what the implications are, especially in North America? So never enough time to do it the way we want, but always trying.
So I'm not going to let you off that easy. So right now. Okay, right now we're in we most of the jurisdictions have sort of a different. Somebody's in charge of the pipes, somebody's in charge of the sites, somebody else is in charge of the safety, okay? And I'd like you to explore a little bit sort of how you see those interacting together, because it used to be pretty separate, right? But now that we're getting to these more empirical measurement methods and these kind of broad area measurement methods, they're starting to overlap and they're interacting in different ways. So, can you address that question? Because I think it's split that way across every jurisdiction.
Yeah, we in Colorado are definitely grappling with that quite a lot. And that goes not just for oil and gas, that kind of goes across the whole everything, because these greenhouse gas targets that were established by the legislature are economy-wide, and so it's not just oil and gas. And then the way they broke some of these things down is a little bit interesting, where oil and gas is actually part of two different sectors. There's the oil and gas sector, and then there's the industrial sector, which is all of our combustion emissions. So it's a little bit awkward at times. But that means that we have to work really closely with our Colorado Department of Transportation, because they've got all of the transportation emissions. And while we can do certain things, they may be able to do other things that can regulate transportation. We have, authority over oil and gas production, but not necessarily pre-production, whereas our Energy and Carbon Management Commission, which was formerly the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, they have authority more over the drilling and the pre-production. And so we've been working really closely with them for a number of years to try to figure out how to split the duties to the extent that they need to be and or to complement one another. One of the exciting things that came out of the 2014 rulemaking was that everybody got IR cameras, and our staff did, and the OGCC at the time got IR cameras. And so that put a lot more inspectors out there in the field with IR cameras. And so while we maybe were looking for slightly different things or had different authorities, we were able to share that information and kind of work together. In the most recent situations where we're having flights kind of analogous to the IR camera early on, now when we have these flights, we have responders that maybe say something was seen, it's coming from the ground in the middle of nowhere in western Colorado, and nobody knows what it is. And so we have developed a working relationship and a process with ECMC to be able to reach out to their inspectors, because they're on the West Coast. They have a presence on the West Slope, West Slope, which is what we call the western half of Colorado. And they've got a presence out there, whereas our inspectors, they would have to drive from Denver. And so driving out there is not always very fast or easy. And so they will send someone out to say, okay, there's a spot where there's a big plume coming from the ground, and then we'll get pictures back of dead grass because there's a pipeline leak, because it's a gathering line. And so then they're reaching out to, they've got a little more information on where the pipelines are. And then ECMC has the authority over flow lines. Flow lines are all of the pipelines that are going in between production facilities. But once it leaves the production sector, it goes into the gathering lines. And gathering lines are actually owned by midstream, and they're covered under PHMSA. So that's not something where we have any state authority, really. But it's an opportunity for us to say, hey, this is where we're locating emissions. So how do we incorporate that, at least response program? And so we've had really good responses where upstream operators, they're the ones that actually have to shut in their equipment, because they're the ones feeding that gathering line until the midstream company can come out and actually fix it. And so that's been tricky, but it's so far been pretty positive in terms of how they're all working together. I think, too, we're looking for regulatory mechanisms to bring in things that we historically haven't been able to cover. As I said, ECMC, they're more on the drilling and pre-production side, whereas the division has authority over the production equipment. But our intensity program covers both, because it's an operator-wide intensity program. And so we say we don't care where the emissions are coming from. If they're your emissions from pre-production or production, you have to account for those in your total emissions for that year in your intensity calculation. So there are some other kind of regulatory tricks that we can start to pull in areas that we don't maybe have direct authority over, to kind of give them this umbrella of, we don't care where it's coming from. If it's coming from your processes, then we want to account for it. And so that's one of the ways that we've also been able to try to bring in those things and cover all of the things. But gathering lines and midstream facilities are on my list.
Yeah, and on the U.S., there's a lot of U.S. federal agencies involved in oil and gas methane. So in addition to EPA, you have BLM regulating on public lands, and have PHMSA regulating the pipelines, and there's some coordination between the agencies, but it's could be improved, I think. There's definitely, the agencies comment on each other's regulations, and you have groups like the OMB that try to make sure there's some consistency. But yeah, generally we are doing our own rulemaking separately. But on the research side, I think there's even more agencies involved. So you have DOE and NASA, NIST, NOAA, all these groups doing various research on methane emissions that could really inform regulation. So there's starting to be more coordination. There is a federal greenhouse gas task force that's involved in all these agencies looking at some of the cutting edge research. And I believe President Biden recently announced some kind of a cabinet level methane task force or something. So there is a huge amount of interest up to the very top of the federal government in oil and gas methane. So I'm confident there will hopefully be more coordination in the future, both on the research and regulatory side.
Another convening operation, another convening opportunity for MDL, David.
Not as complicated in Canada, I think, because in part of what I said constitutionally, from an environmental perspective, our climate policy, we have the ability to intervene everywhere. So still jurisdictional issues there, but essentially we wrote our first regulations, even though they have the title upstream in the title. The definition says this applies to production and processing and transmission. So whether it's a compressor station on a transmission station or in a gas gathering system or at a gas plant, like all of them are covered in our regulations. It becomes complicated though when we devolve the implementation to the provinces because the jurisdictional coverage is variable. Then it could be our federal regulator who still has some responsibility for some sites. But our effort was to try to write the rules as universally applicable and then deal with the interpretation of it after. So.
Do you have a question from the audience?
We have a million questions from the audience, like quite a million. My math skills have faded over the years. So I'm not going to ask this question in earnest, but I feel like I should have had a competition among you to say, what do you think the number one question is for David? So I'll let you stew on that, and I'll give you the answer to that at the end. I'm pretty sure you could all guess. But because I have the microphone, I get to pick the questions that are also really fascinating to me, and so you'll understand selfishly why I'm selecting. What are your views, and this is for all three of you, on how universities and researchers can help your offices most effectively on methane regulation and ways to foster regulator research engagement? So how can we bring the work that we're doing most effectively and efficiently to you? What's helpful?
I feel like I'm the one that always jumps in to answer because I have lots of thoughts and opinions. So one of the cool things, again, around the flexibility of our greenhouse gas authority is that we are getting to think a little more outside of the box, and we all recognize that we can't do it on our own. We don't have the technical expertise, we don't have the time or the ability to actually do everything, to learn everything that we would like to learn. But we've also got great universities that are doing a lot of this work. And so where I see this relationship as being really beneficial is in additional computational power. You've got people that actually know how to write code. And I'm not going to teach myself to write code. I've tried to teach myself, it didn't work. And so, these are things that we don't have the skills, and historically we've maybe been asked to kind of do without because we either don't have it or we're just relying on what's already been published and what's out there. And this was an opportunity for us to get proactive and actually go say, hey, these are the questions we have. How can we answer them? One, are there papers out there that are already answering them? Two, are there preprint papers out there that someone would be willing to send to us a little bit early so that we can take a look at that? Three, if not, what can you do to help us answer those questions? And so that's really what we've been trying to do in working with MDL, and why we believe so thoroughly in this effort is because we have questions and we can't answer them, but we know who can, and that's really this community. And so what we have been able to do is we were granted about $7 million in 2021 to develop a temporary aerial monitoring program, is what kind of the official line was. And I have extrapolated that into the aerial and ground monitoring program for greenhouse gases, and particularly methane. And now we are going to be using all of that funding, and Ben is here in the audience, and he's been in charge of setting up all of the contracts so that we can actually get all of the data collected so that he can do the fun part, which is actually looking at all of the data. So thank you, Ben. And we're going to be working on that over the next year, and we need this continuously through the future because a one-time, one-year measurement campaign is not enough, and we all know it. And the reason is because we are actually supposed to be seeing a decrease in emissions over time, and we can only do that if we're consistently measuring emissions over time. And so we've got a program that I think needs to extend well beyond 2030, where we are actively looking at where are methane emissions coming from. It's going to help us better understand where we can establish new rules and requirements. It's going to help us find and fix problems that are actually out there. And ultimately, it's going to help us demonstrate to the public in a much more comfortable way for the public that we are actually seeing the emission reductions that we all think we're seeing. We all want to see the actual data line that shows that maybe not linear, downward trend, but some kind of downward trend going along this way. So I'm a big believer in using whatever resources that I can convince to work for me for free, and that's where Dan is for me. He's my call a guy when I have no money, but he's also the guy that when I do have money to share, I'm calling him too. So we definitely want to get into funneling as much money as we can into these efforts so that we can get the best information that's frankly targeted for policymakers to be actionable, because that's what we need right now.
Great, yeah, and I'll just add to that, I think what's been really helpful is having academics present their data to EPA, and I think especially when you can give kind of regulatory context about the data and what do your results say and what are implications for regulations, and just clearly lining out, like this data shows this regulation or this thing won't work. And I think, not to pick on folks, but I think Arvin and Dave are great at giving really clear comments that, present the data, have suggestions, things like the matrix approach got incorporated into the proposed regulation. So because I think EPA and other agencies are just inherently conservative just due to the legal reasons. So especially if your research is showing something that's kind of different than the past paradigm, then I think you kind of have to keep repeating it, but eventually we'll get it and hopefully have more science-based regulations.
And I think I'm echoing most of what has been said. Having a public reference is so important. So whether that comes in through a consultation process or whether it's just publishing and offering that data in a public context and allowing others to use it. But then lastly, I do think we're going to need to change how we think about this relationship going forward. The constraints around government and setting up new programs and funding new work. It's not necessarily going to be for free, but to build that relationship so that we're utilizing the capacity that exists in the country or countries rather than trying to think of the government executing a program on its own.
I think, too, I'm going to add to what I said. Another piece that I think is really critical is that operators aren't known for wanting to share their data. And that's been a problem in the past where we know they have data that could help us either support or undo, change our minds on something, but they're maybe only willing to share like this piece of it. They're not willing to share all of it. And that's going to continue to be the case for the next several years. Obviously, there's a continual cry for making more data publicly available, putting it out there in the public domain. And I'm a firm believer that I think that's the direction we all need to be moving. But I can't wait for it all to be in the public domain to be able to move on this issue. And so if I can use the universities and the academic organizations to create a bridge where I can trust the academic organization, but I'm not going to necessarily trust data coming directly from the vendor or from the company themselves and their analysis. I need someone else who's going to look at that. And then they can build a relationship that says the academic organization is only going to share results, the high level information. They're going to screen some of that information. And then we can all build kind of that trust around data sharing and get around that problem, at least in the short term and likely in the long term as well.
So as a follow-up to that, kind of what you see the capacity needs, kind of, personnel capacity needs are in your agency, and, kind of what would that capacity building look like?
Maybe I'll start. EPA needs about, I think it's over 2,000 people. And we need a lot of people, including in oil and gas methane. So currently, for all this IRA methane stuff, people are just being detailed from other parts of EPA, and we're slowly getting people hired, but we need a lot of oil and gas methane experts. I'm skeptical there's 2,000 of them out there, and if there are, there's a lot of competition for all the various people who need them, but yeah, definitely we need some more staff capacity.
I don't think we're going to have that opportunity in Canada in the same way. And as we put forward the regulations, the earlier question around multi-level cooperation, like that becomes crucial. So as a federal government, we're not going to implement this alone for sure. And what we will do is try to reallocate resources from existing regulatory initiatives. So, raise the profile of the methane regulations compared to other aspects of oil and gas sector regulation. And try and build the capacity to intervene at the in the right way. But it'll be the provincial regulators who are the key horsepower to deliver regulations in Canada, I think, on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. And similarly, in Colorado, states aren't known for wanting the federal government to be messing in their stuff. And Colorado's no different. And so to the extent that we can build up capacity and support the implementation of all of these rules and let EPA go and work on areas where they have jurisdiction and they don't have maybe that agency that can kind of take over, whether it's tribal lands or whether it's states that are maybe less aggressive. So we're definitely working on building up capacity. We need people who can do data analysis. We need people who understand the methane technology and can kind of keep up on the state and the evolving state of this technology that can help design programs, design campaigns for going out and doing measurements. And then we're going to need the kind of in the middle people, the people that can take that technical information and turn it into policy, because that's an art as well. And so that's going to be really critical for us, is how do we build up that kind of middle ground of people that can do that. And like David said, there is a limited pool of people that already have that experience, and therefore it's going to be a lot of training and bringing people up to speed, but it's also going to be tremendous amount of opportunity there.
We do. We still have many, many questions. We'll run out of time before we run out of questions. I'm going to combine a couple of them. I hear this question from a lot of people, and I think it's a challenging one to answer, but I'm interested in your thoughts. I'll kind of combine the two, asking really about how do you know when technology is ready or proven enough for regulation? And I think it's referring specifically to measurement technology, and the second combined question kind of asks really about, are there certain indicators or data quality indicators or a precision or an accuracy? Do you have some ideas of what you wish for and what makes something kind of ready for prime time in that type of application, which has an enforcement implication, right?
So the way that we're doing it in Colorado, because there isn't an answer to that. There isn't a single data quality indicator. There isn't a single number that says that's good enough and that's not good enough. And so instead, the way that we're approaching it is to say all measurement is good measurement. It's how you use it and what assumptions have gone into it and how you've limited the assumptions that have gone into that. And so what we're really looking for from operators is to be critical in their thinking about, these are the tools that are available to me. How do I use them to best inform my inventory? What assumptions am I making? Are there ways to minimize those assumptions? For example, using parametric data to limit the time scope for how long an event lasted, for example, or even things that can get into controls. We have seen operators that don't want to put on flow meters to their emission control devices So instead, they have put on a pressure actuator where they're actually only allowing emissions to go to that enclosed control device when the pressure is sufficient for the device to actually function. So you're not getting this low level of constant working and breathing emissions going from a storage tank to an ECD, and instead you're getting a sufficient amount of gas all at once so that the ECD actually works according to manufacturer specifications. So there are a number of ways that we can go about this. And while I want to stress that I think measurement, meaning direct measurement or measurement of emissions, is critical to all of this, quantification of those emissions and using quantification to inform an inventory is not always linear. It's not always, oh, I take that number and I plug it in here. It's much more complex than that. And so we want to know, how are they making all of that make sense in terms of a measurement-informed inventory? And then we want to see it evolve. So what we're going to do with the intensity program is, right now we're working on, for a number of operators, what is it they want to do in 2025 to demonstrate that they've developed a measurement-informed inventory. And then once we're kind of through this process, we're going to give them the thumbs up, and we're going to say, go do it. And ultimately, it matters less to us whether it was perfect or not, as they did it. If they did it, and then they do a full evaluation of that program, and they can identify, here are the things that would be better in the next time. Here are the things where we had a problem. Here's where the weather never cooperated. Those kinds of things. And then they're developing improved plans for future use. That's what we want to see. We want to see the iteration, because we think it's really, really, really critical that operators are out there measuring now and not waiting for the perfect solution.
Yeah, EPA is working on this issue. I don't think I can give any official comments. I will say I took a quick look through the comments, and they're on the reporting program, and there's a lot of comments asking for an approach to approve alternative technologies. But I can maybe give my personal opinion. So I think really, I think like Steph said, it's understanding assumptions. I think particularly it's metrics calculating the uncertainty of measurements. So I'd like to see things like published single-blind controlled releases, and having known minimum detection limits, which is often a function of like wind speed and other things. So I think if the policy people can have that data, then you can kind of make a policy determination of what's acceptable uncertainty for your final answer. But say a lot of the current emission estimates have very high or even just unknown uncertainty. So I think even if we're getting plus or minus 30, 50% on some of these emission estimates, it might be good enough for making policy decisions. But yeah, I think you really, really need to see kind of validation of the performance of these technologies.
I'll start by going back to what I said early today, that it depends on who's writing the rules under what powers, because some opportunity for flexibility is there that other regulators don't have. So, and in a federal context for us, it's criminal powers. So we don't have a lot of flexibility in the rules themselves. But if we can write a rule that's kind of good enough and then surround it with guidance, I think that's probably the best outcome that we can have without trying to be too prescriptive too early. And we watch other regulators a lot, so I guess it's whoever's out first and decides that they can do something. There's certainly a challenge right away to try and make that integrated, integral to our rules as well.
So I think we're down to the last 3 minutes, so everybody's wondering what was the top-ranked question for our EPA rep. So we don't want to run out of time before we throw that one out. And everybody can stare quickly at David to see how he reacts.
David, when will the rule be final?
I can actually answer at least. So we're meeting the congressional deadline of August 2024. I think the rulemaking schedule currently says spring of next year. So maybe that early, but we'll at least get it out by August.
Great. So we have only a minute or two left. So rapid fire session, you have like 30 seconds to make closing comments. And as part of that closing comment, make a pitch to all the grad students in the room of why they would want to work in your agency.
Oh, okay, I'll go first. Colorado's better than Texas?
Stephanie, how dare you?
You know, we're doing some really, really innovative and really fun things, and the whole division is growing, and we're being allowed to do things that we haven't historically been able to do in the boxes that we've lived in the past. And so I really do think that working for Colorado right now is a pretty amazing place to be. And we definitely need people who like to sit at their desks and look at a bunch of data and then tell me what it means. And then we'll do something with it. And I think that's the really key thing, is that we're willing to actually do something with that information and not just get an analysis and not act on it. So.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, EPA needs a lot of staff, of technical staff, so there's tons of opportunities, including for recent graduate students, and EPA, the federal government does pay pretty well and has good benefits, and I'll say that EPA has a really great culture of people are very passionate about their environment and their job. They're all very intelligent, so it is a wonderful place to work. I highly recommend it.
I'll maybe offer personal experience. So I worked in industry initially out of school. I've got an undergrad chem eng and an MBA. I did some consulting work. And why did I go work for the government? Because I thought there's a lot of good ideas out there, and why can't the government be doing these good ideas? So it was my personal curiosity, and I think that is the reason why you would go work for the government. It's really intriguing to understand the science, but then try and implement it in a policy, in a political world and in a constrained world from a policy perspective. So it's a real challenge, and it's like fun to do. And when you get in a field like we are right now, we are doing some really, really intriguing and like fantastic work to really change the industry itself.
Let's thank the panel, and we'll move on to our next speaker.